Well, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just gonna give 1 minute to let people filter into the webinar today. Um, but I want to welcome you all to today's discussion on firearm purchaser licensing, policy, research, and the real world impact. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us. My name is Silvia Villarreal. I am the Director of Research Translation at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions and Managing Director at the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy. And I have the honor to be your moderator today. I'm also joined by a remarkable panel of experts, Dr. Cassandra Crifasi, Mr. Dylan O'Connor, and Congressman Jamie Raskin, who will be joining us soon. And just as a disclaimer, the opinions shared here are each owns and not the opinions of Johns Hopkins. Um, Also, before we begin, I would like to share a quick note on logistics. This session will last 1 hour and we'll have time for a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A feature that we have here on Zoom, and I'll try to address as many as possible. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us again. Um, Today's webinar is anchored in the findings of a comprehensive report that we authored at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions in collaboration with the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy. And this report takes an evidence-based approach to examining firearm purchaser licensing, assessing its research, analyzing current state laws, and translating those findings into actionable policy recommendations. So this report, which you can access through the QR code that you see here on the screen, reflects a collaborative process that brought together leading experts from public health, from law, from policy, and convening this wide range of perspectives was very intentional and essential to our process. And what emerged from that process was a clear consensus. Firearm purchaser licensing is one of the most promising policies available to reduce gun violence and save lives. So the evidence in this report, and Dr. Crifasi will speak more to it soon, indicates that licensing laws, when implemented with the key components, such as safety trainings, fingerprinting, the in-person application, and waiting periods, are associated with reductions on different types of gun violence. And one of the most important elements at the time of developing this report was our commitment to equity and harm reduction. So the consortium's process, together with the center, we examined how policies can be structured to protect individuals and their communities without contributing to existing disparities or overcriminalization. So that balance between effectiveness and fairness was really at the heart of the group's discussions and shaped our final recommendations that we have in the report. So all of that to say that today's conversation builds on this foundational work, and it's bringing together our panelists, Dr. Cass Crifasi a research expert whose extensive studies on firearm purchaser licensing contributed to the evidence presented in this report. We have Mr. Dylan O'Connor, an advocate with in the ground real experience, and Congressman Jamie Raskin, who will speak to the real world implications of implementation. And our goal today really is just to connect the dots between research science, the advocacy strategies, and policymaking. This is not just a theoretical conversation. It's about uncovering what's possible when research guides policymaking and diverse voices are included at the table. So let's start by introducing our first panelist. We are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Cass Crifasi, the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions and co-author of the report Firearm Purchaser Licensing, Research Evidence to Inform State Policy. So, Dr. Crifasi, welcome. Can you start us by briefly explaining what firearm purchaser licensing is and the evidence behind this life-saving policy?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I want to start first by sort of anchoring where we are with regard to the burden of gun violence and why this policy is so important. So in 2023, which is the last year that we have complete data, almost 47,000 people died from firearm-related injuries. That translates to someone being killed in an incident involving a gun every 11 minutes. And firearms are used in the majority of homicides. So when a homicide is committed in the US, about 70% of them involve a firearm. And suicide, unfortunately, firearms are quite commonly used in suicide as well. Despite accounting for only about 6% of suicide attempts, firearms are used in more than half of suicide fatalities in the US. And importantly, in 2023, in the US, we actually experienced the highest number and rate of firearm suicides ever recorded. And so this will come back when I'm talking about some of the impacts of these policies, but it's really important to keep in mind, regardless of what we might see in the media, actually the leading cause of firearm death is suicide. And so we need to be thinking about ways to disrupt impulsive acquisition of firearms. And you'll see some QR codes on the bottom that will take you out to the various reports and data that I'm citing. So we have a lot of variation across the states with regard to policy, and that really translates to differences in firearm mortality outcomes. So here you can see we have ranked states by their gun death rate from highest to lowest. You can see that many states that are sort of more lenient in their gun policy, more gun friendly, one might say, and they have much higher rates of firearm mortality. And the states that have stronger policies, many states that have firearm purchaser licensing, you see having much lower rates. So thinking about this data, I'm going to talk a little bit about what these laws are, what the research shows, just again to try to anchor it in some of these data. So you can, next slide, please. So I want to take just a quick minute to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what the federal standards are for the background check system. So we have the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, NICS. It's required anytime you buy a gun from a federally licensed firearm dealer. So you walk into the shop, you fill out your form 4473, you answer a bunch of questions, and that information is sent into the NICS system. And one of three things happens. You either get an immediate proceed, you can sell the firearm to that person, an immediate denial. You don't know why, you just know that that person isn't eligible to purchase, or there can be a delay for additional review. And if there's a delay, maybe it's a common name or something like that, it can take, licensed dealers have up to 3 business days to wait for that background check to come back. And if it doesn't come back in time, they can legally sell the firearm to that person. which may mean that someone who is actually legally prohibited is able to gain access to a firearm from a purchase from a licensed dealer. And then law enforcement has to go take a firearm back from someone who never should have gotten it. And this happens between 5,000 and 6,000 times every year across the country. People are getting guns because their background check hasn't come back in time. There are sometimes also delays in reporting into the system or some information not being reported. And so relying only on the federal system might miss information that would tell a licensed dealer that this person is prohibited. And it's not required for private sellers. And so some states have closed that gap. 21 states and the District of Columbia have said, we think that anybody who wants to buy a gun should be required to undergo a background check, regardless of from whom they are purchasing it. But that system on its own, without the components of the firearm purchaser licensing, have not yet been enough to reduce violence. And as Sylvia mentioned at the top, these firearm purchaser licensing systems include a fingerprint-based background check, an application that is processed by state law enforcement such that you're looking at both state and local records in addition to federal records, often safety training, and the license isn't issued until that background check is complete. And so it fills many of these gaps that we have in the federal system. And this translates into real world impacts on violence. Next slide. So firearm purchaser licensing is one of the most robust policies we have that can reduce multiple forms of violence and sources of guns into underground markets. So we know that in large urban cities in states with firearm purchaser licensing laws, we see significantly lower rates of firearm homicide. We also know that among the people most vulnerable for violence, victimization, and perpetration, those aged 15 to 24, states with these laws have lower rates of homicide among that age group. We see lower rates of mass shootings and fewer people being injured should mass shootings occur in states with firearm purchaser licensing. Again, thinking about delaying impulsive acquisition by requiring a license, or having additional screening that might deter someone from acquiring a firearm who's going to use it to harm themselves or others. We also see lower rates of suicide, again, also among that vulnerable group, those aged 15 to 24. We see lower rates of diversions of guns for use in crime. In fact, in Maryland, after our firearm purchaser licensing law was passed, we spoke to people in the underground gun market, and they said guns were more expensive, specifically because of the license. People wouldn't go buy guns for you, and it was harder to find trusted sources. And some of our more recent work has shown that firearm purchaser licensing is associated with lower rates of civilians being shot by police, as well as police being shot by civilians. Again, thinking about how we can constrain local markets for underground market firearms and making sure that it's harder for people who might use them to harm themselves or others to get them. Next slide. The report talks about a couple of really important case studies. A lot of the work that we've done has looked at changes in Connecticut and Missouri. And we are seeing that in Connecticut, which implemented a very robust version of this law, reductions in both homicide and suicide. And when you looked at Missouri, which repealed a very robust law in 2007, we saw the exact opposite. We saw important increases and significant increases in homicide and suicide among this group. And so thinking about this policy as a population level tool to make sure that only those who can legally gain access to firearms are able to purchase them, making sure that folks are only selling to people with a valid license, can constrain those local markets, reduce straw purchasing. And it's also a really popular policy in addition to being effective. So next slide. So we do biannual public opinion polling, and we ask folks, what do you think of these particular very specific types of policies? And more than 70% of US adults support requiring somebody to get a license before buying a gun. This includes almost 2/3 of gun owners and over 60% of Republicans. So this really has bipartisan support. It's supported by gun owners as well. And in fact, when you ask gun owners who live in states where these policies already exist, support among those gun owners jumps to 75%. you've demystified the process. They likely have experience with it. I've gone through the process in Maryland myself in order to buy handguns. It is not a complicated or onerous process, but it does help to make sure that people who shouldn't be able to gain access to firearms can't get them. And with that, I'll turn it back to Sylvia. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crifasi, for walking us through that compelling body of evidence. The data that you shared from the firearm deaths to your research in Connecticut and Missouri is really impressive. It really shows how firearm purchaser licensing can shape gun violence at the state level. Also, I want to add a brief reminder to our audience that if you have questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to submit them to the Q&A feature, and we'll make time to address those questions at the end. Now let's transition to Mr. Dylan O'Connor. Now that we've heard about the research that supports firearm purchaser licensing, let's turn to that on the ground perspective. What it takes to actually pass a law like this at the state level. So we are very fortunate today to be joined by Mr. Dylan O'Connor. He is currently a government affairs consultant with the Alliance for Gun Responsibility and served in the organization in a staff role for almost 8 years. Most notably, as the Alliance Government Affairs Director, Dylan works on the ground in the state capitol, coordinating legislative strategy and interfacing with stakeholders that includes lawmakers, community coalitions, and public health experts to pass life-saving gun violence prevention legislation. He has helped spearhead data-driven advocacy efforts supporting Washington's new firearm purchaser licensing law. So, Dylan, what can advocates, what can people learn from Washington experience and successes?
Yeah, well, thanks, Sylvia, and thanks everybody for having me today. It's good to see some familiar faces and names in the chat. Yeah, just by a little bit of a way of background, so the Alliance for Gun Responsibility is sort of the tip of the spear gun violence prevention organization here in Washington State. And the story of how we came to pass our permit to purchase law, we call it permit to purchase here in Washington State, but it's our FPL law. Is a longer one, and I promise I won't do the whole long form story just for the sake of time. But I do think it's worth mentioning that, we started really working on the permit to purchase law itself and its advocacy sphere almost 10 years ago, and our organization goes back a little bit longer than that. So, we were founded immediately after the Sandy Hook tragedy, where a group of stakeholders here in Washington sort of correctly surmised that the likelihood of rapid progress on gun violence prevention at the federal level was probably not going to happen anytime soon, and that the best path forward to saving as many lives as possible would be action at the state level. So they, launched their first effort. We have a ballot initiative process here in Washington State, and we've gone to the ballot 3 times. Once in 2014, that closed our background check loophole here in Washington. In 2016, we established our extreme risk protection order law via ballot initiative. And then most recently, 2018 was the last one that we did, which, among other things, imposed a child access prevention law, raised the minimum age of purchase for semi-automatic weapons, things like that. We've gone back to the legislature every year to pass more and more, better and better gun violence prevention policy, and it's been a long road. You know, by the time we had begun really socializing permit to purchase in Washington in a real way, we had just started to see more rapid progress on gun violence prevention in Olympia, which is our state capital. But up to that point, and shortly there, before that, Washington had, up until we started doing our work, seen gun violence prevention generally as a third rail issue. and we worked really hard over the years to pull the legislature in the right direction. The research and data component of that has been a massive part of our success here in Washington. And as helps us underscore the framing of gun violence as a public health issue rather than an ideological one. And it brings home, like, I'm sure folks are affected when we see Dr. Crifasi's presentation on the scale of the problem and the psychological impact that we try to bring that feeling to every single intersection of our advocacy. So as we were passing laws in Washington and trying to, march forward our path on permit to purchase, we realized fairly quickly that the path to a licensing system was going to be stepwise here in Washington State. And we probably needed to be as efficient as possible, take other policy steps first, while we were continuing to socialize gun violence prevention as a winning issue, and pass bills like the centralization of our background check system. So we didn't have a single point of contact here in Washington State. Making sure that happened also informed other stair steps toward, being able to put together a really comprehensive and efficient permitting system, getting safety training requirements for purchases on the books, things like that. So, we have seen a lot of success in building the research and data sharing component of our advocacy into every aspect of our communication with the legislature, decision makers, and really everybody who's listening. And sharing that data, especially, we have a research ecosystem here in Washington State. We have a research program at Harborview. Um, but I'll say, having the Johns Hopkins sort of brand on your research lends a weight of credibility for sure to what we're sharing with legislators. And I have found just anecdotally that we do get fewer critiques from folks or devil's advocate like conversations and engagement with decision makers when we have the name attached. So we use that data, and of course, as much as we can in the bill drafting and system crafting, of course, but also like again, this constant communication and repetition to legislators and staff during the interim time between sessions. And that kind of comes, in a few different prongs. One is from a communications like department perspective, right? So that's calls to action, regular emails and conversations directly from the Alliance, our nonprofit, and our staff and our lobbyists, but also a field approach. So that's volunteers and constituents in district repeating that information, and again to legislators and staff. And I will say one of the things we were successful in making, the groundswell where we were hearing it over and over again is Dr. Crifasi's point on the comparison between Connecticut and Missouri, right? So we make an effort to repeat that so many times that by the time, I'm between the House and Senate doors in Olympia with some of our folks down there, legislators are educating me, and they're like, "Did you know that Connecticut passed this?" And that's what you want to have happen, right? And doing that and making sure that the data is showing up repeated in as many contexts as possible for legislators and decision makers, connects for electeds that what they hear from us is also what their constituents care about, and that they'll be holding them accountable for those things. So it's a great way to associate the data and the research in a way that legislators are able to hold and repeat information to their colleagues as well. Also equipping each advocate subgroup with the most relevant and useful information for them at the right moment, at the right time. So for permit to purchase, framing over a long period of time has been a huge, huge deal that they should consider this to be the thing that we are building toward because the data tells us so, right? I mean, the folks who have just seen Dr. Crifasi's presentation, I mean, it is hard to imagine another single policy a state can enact that would have such a broad impact on a state's firearm homicide and suicide rate. In terms of those subgroups, volunteers typically do really, really well with like the 5 to 7 individual statistics for a policy like FPL or permit to purchase, along with like data summary statements like, the data does show that this law in other states has a tremendous impact and we should do this. Legislators do incorporate those into their talking points. So we hear them repeated back in committee and on the floor, on the campaign trail. So the groundswell of data just gets circulated over and over again. It's also super helpful in countering what the opposition messaging is going to be, especially if we get out ahead of them with good data. So again, that Connecticut and Missouri sort of counterpoint we have found that to be really, really powerful. And also, demystifies the process too. So if we're attaching the data that we expect to see, firearm homicide and suicide rate mitigated at this rate through this process, and connecting the public health impact really helps people understand what's going to go on and how they're going to be able to buy a firearm. And just in the nitty-gritty of session, having all of this data and understanding on process helps with the crafting of responses to like bad amendments that go to the floor on a very short turnaround, rather than having to scrape together our talking points at the last minute. We're really real well prepared with this stuff going in. So writ large, I think Johns Hopkins has been really helpful in those regards, but especially this last year, the last couple of years, Johns Hopkins, you helped us make a wonderful fact sheet for Washington specifically on the effectiveness of the proposed permit to purchase system. That fact sheet included an estimate of how many lives in Washington would not have been lost had there been a system in place. Tremendously psychologically impactful. And we saw everything, basically every word on that piece of paper, digital piece of paper, repeated on the floor during debate. We also used that data and Dr. Crifasi's time to put on a legislative briefing in the fall last year ahead of legislative session. We encouraged legislators to join and ask any and all of the questions they were going to ask about the law. So importantly, using the data in that way gave us an amazing window into what this year's specific conversation was going to be around permit to purchase in caucus, because we're hearing that directly from legislators ahead of session. And everything we heard on that webinar definitely came up in those caucus conversations. So it allowed us to craft the data and package it in a way that we knew would head off opposition arguments. And those conversations were like, how exactly does a permit to purchase system help mitigate gun violence, which we were able to answer, fairly robustly. And then the other question was, how much is this going to cost, right? Which sort of leads me to my last point. Some of the things I think we learned this year in passing permit to purchase was, as much as we can connect the data that Dr. Crifasi is going over with how much the problem costs the average taxpayer in a state, and saving lives also saves money. Now budget writers are really listening to you, right? And it's something that we want them to repeat, just like the other data points. I also think drilling down as much as possible to show as strongly as you can the evidence that permit to purchase systems, or FPLs, can reduce firearm deaths across populations broadly. We got a lot of questions from key legislators this year as to what any difference there might be between the demographics of our population here in Washington in terms of effectiveness, and we were able to jump in with that. But the more data there, the better, especially for chairs who are hearing those from their constituents. So that's what I've got in terms of my main point here, and I can jump into the chat or answer some Q&As and stuff, Sylvia. But yeah, that's the net.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you so much for sharing your experience on what is possible when community and advocacy organizations get together and elevate the evidence, use, research translation to push for change. Your experience really is a great reminder that policy does not only live on paper, like it's something that's alive. It's built through partnerships, through persistence, and just a shared commitment to implement change. So thank you very much for your advocacy and leadership. Well, now, to help us understand how this research translates into real world policy, I'd like to turn to Congressman Raskin. Congressman Jamie Raskin represents Maryland 8th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Congressman Raskin was chosen by the Democratic caucus to be the ranking member of the House Committee on the Judiciary in the 119th Congress. During his prior terms in Congress, Representative Raskin also served on the Committee on House Administration, the Rules Committee, and the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. Representative Raskin was appointed as the lead impeachment manager in the second impeachment trial of the former President Donald Trump in 2021, and later served on the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. So, Congressman Raskin, welcome. It's clear that you have been at the forefront of legislative efforts to implement policies like firearm purchaser licensing law. So, could you tell us a bit about your experience?
Yes, indeed. And Sylvia, thank you for having me as part of this really important conversation. We do have a bill in Congress now, which is HR 532, which is the Handgun Permit to Purchase Act, which is based on the laws that have been adopted in, I think, 14 or 15 states, including in Maryland. And as a state senator, I was actually involved in sponsoring and helping be the floor leader on the omnibus legislation that we had in 2013, the Maryland Firearms, I think it's called Maryland Firearms Purchase Act was that specific one. But we did a whole bunch of reforms, including banning assault weapons, high capacity magazines, having random regular checks at the gun dealers and so on. But there was a handgun permitting provision in there. That was upheld by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals earlier this year, or maybe it was the end of last year, and the Supreme Court declined to review it. So that's a win for us. Now, those were back in the days when I used to get a lot of legislation passed. Okay. It's very different in Congress. We're obviously in something of a stalemate in terms of, the most sweeping legislation we could do. We did pass in 2022 the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This was after the nightmare in Uvalde took place and the Buffalo supermarket shooting. And that was the first time in 3 decades that Congress had acted. And there were some effective and meaningful provisions that were in there. We did not get, anything close to handgun licensing or, ban on assault weapons or high capacity magazines. But it did expand the background check, which was good, including making it more effective at gun shows. And it established new federal offenses for straw purchases. And I think we also, we did enhanced background checks for young people under 21 because of who some of the killers were. Because, in the manner of things, oftentimes the legislation just responds to the last crime rather than trying to think comprehensively about the problem, which is precisely what the licensing permitting legislation is all about. So we are in something of a paralysis nationally. And I don't want to compromise anybody's 501c3 status in these days, but I think it will take a change in political direction, change in political leadership in Congress before we get serious about doing the real things that we need to do. Some of that does have to do with just structural forces that are financially invested in no change. Some of the manufacturers and the dealers who are just making money off of this very profitable business model, which is just extremely dangerous and lethal for the rest of society. But I think there's also an ideological component and dimension to it. And maybe I'll just close with a thought about that, because when we are able to have debates about gun safety legislation and we're able to debate gun violence, oftentimes my colleagues across the aisle will say that, well, there's really nothing that can be done because under the Second Amendment, there can be no regulation of firearms. Anything that we do violates the Second Amendment. And we know that because the purpose of the Second Amendment is to guarantee that the people will be as well armed as the government so the people can overthrow the government. And this is the very popular insurrectionary theory of the Second Amendment, that it's not about hunting, as Lauren Boebert said, unless you're talking about hunting tyrants. And it's not about self-defense. It's about the people's right to overthrow the government. So, but what I'm trying to do is to dismantle this claim, which is completely at odds with our Constitution, our constitutional precedent, and the history of the Second Amendment and the rest of the Constitution. The Second Amendment, of course, talks about a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Supreme Court has said that gives you a right to a handgun for purposes of self-defense, and it gives you a right to a rifle, a long arm, a gun for purposes of hunting and recreation. But even Justice Scalia said it does not prevent local governments and state governments from acting in a way to protect public security and the safety of the people. And so much of the Constitution contradicts the idea that the people have the right to overthrow the government. For one thing, look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, which says that Congress has the power to call forth the militias from the states in order to repel invasions, enforce the law, and suppress insurrections. The Constitution, also in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14, says that Congress has the power to regulate the militias. A militia is not the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. A militia is organized by the states, by the government. That's what a well-regulated militia is. It's not just a group of people who get together and decide to overthrow the government. The treason clause in the Constitution, the only place where a crime is even defined, defines treason as levying arms against the Union, trying to overthrow the government. The Republican Guarantee Clause says that Congress shall guarantee to the people a Republican form of government and assist them in suppressing domestic violence and insurrection. So I could cite to you another half dozen provisions, but check out my favorite, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which says that that anyone who swears an oath to uphold and support the Constitution, who violates the oath by engaging in insurrection or rebellion, shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. So it's even in the 14th Amendment. We do not have a Constitution that supports violent insurrection against the police or against the government. If we did, of course, the 1,400 people who Donald Trump pardoned as violent insurrectionists would not have had to be pardoned because they never would have been convicted in the first place, because they would have had a defense of insurrection. But that's not a valid constitutional defense. And when I point all this stuff out, my colleagues only say two things to me in reply. One is they quote Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," which was a wonderful slogan from the 18th century, but it's not in the Constitution. In any event, Patrick Henry was an anti-federalist who voted against the Constitution. So why would his slogans come to inform our interpretation of what the Constitution means? The other thing they say sometimes is, well, what about the Declaration of Independence? What about the Revolution? We took up arms against a tyrant, and so that's what our revolutionary experience means. That one has more surface plausibility. The problem with it is that when the American revolutionaries conducted the revolution, they weren't citing the Magna Carta or British law. They were citing natural law. They basically said that, when in the course of human events, if a government turns tyrannical, you've got a natural law right to try to take them on, which is why they appealed to the opinions and the ideas and the support of mankind, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, but they never claimed it was legally ordained. And this is something Lincoln talked about a lot. It would be ridiculous to say that the Constitution authorizes destruction of the Constitution. So if you want to come down and try to overthrow the government, invoking your natural law rights, you can do it. But if you get caught and you get arrested, you get stopped, we're going to prosecute you and we're going to, give you due process of law, but you're going to jail, at least until you're pardoned. You've got uh, the right to invoke your natural law, right to overthrow the government. If you really think that, for example, the 2020 presidential election was akin to King George's tyranny against the colonies. But you're on your own there, and you can't invoke the Constitution for that. All of which is to say there's not an insurrectionary right in the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, in its most radically expansive interpretation of the Second Amendment, said that you've got the right to, engage in self-defense, and you've got the right to hunting and recreation, but you do not have a right to take up arms against the police or against the government. And I think it's going to be very important for us to turn that insurrectionary ideology around in order to have a real breakthrough and remind people we can engage in common sense gun safety solutions, like what we're talking about today, which is licensing, which was such an important part of the Maryland reforms that we did back in 2013. So I'll yield back to you, Sylvia, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Congressman Raskin, for your insightful perspective. It is incredibly valuable how research-informed policies like this one are navigated in the legislative process and what it takes to build support and address concerns and get it across the finish line. So really hearing each of your perspectives on how this law has come to life in different states like Washington and Maryland, and the impact that it's already making really brings today's discussion into full circle. So now let's turn to some questions from the audience. And here's a very thoughtful one. And I believe Congressman Raskin is the most suited to answer, but Dr. Crifasi, Dylan, feel free to jump in. Given the public support for many of the proposed gun safety legislation, why do you think these bills have been stopped by legislators?
Thank you. So we're in a very polarized moment politically, obviously. And each party is identified with a different position on gun safety measures generally, where the Democrats are the party of reasonable common sense gun safety as we see it, and the GOP regards themselves as the party of the Second Amendment, which they've interpreted for reasons I just explained as categorically no regulation. And they don't concede the constitutionality of any regulation, or they say, well, we have enough as it is, let's just enforce the laws as they exist today. So we're kind of stuck in that situation. And that's why, I find it somewhat hopeful to try to break through by actually looking at the arguments that people are making. And if we can strip away the ideological and rhetorical edifice of the argumentation, then maybe we can look at what's really going on in terms of the money that's being put in by an industry that's invested in the current model on that side. Again, that's from my own partisan perspective. And the thing about living in a partisan time is it's very hard to, escape the partisan prism, but that is the way that I see it. And I'm hopeful that the majority will continue to keep the heat on, and not just when there's another disaster, because there's a disaster happening every day, but they don't always have the apocalyptic mass nature of the mass shootings. But I mean, we have the equivalent of Uvalde happening every single day when you add up the death count.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Crifasi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to add that based on what we have seen, I mentioned we have really broad public support for this type of policy. The challenge is often related to depth of support. So we know that this is supported by 2/3 of gun owners, but they may be activated on things other than permit to purchase or firearm purchaser licensing. Maybe even something as simple as they're not aware that this is one of the most effective policies. And so that's why part of what we do is educating not just policymakers, but advocates and community members so that when they're asking for solutions to gun violence, they can talk about the things that are as effective as firearm purchaser licensing so that people have a solution in mind when they can reach out to policymakers, because that activation difference between sort of the gun safety and the gun rights side, I think, has challenged the passage of some of these laws. And we're seeing that shift. But really getting the information into the hands of the folks who need it to make the changes is continues to be an important step.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. We have another question from the audience, and that is, would any of the speakers have advice on advocating for firearm purchaser licensing in a more conservative state that currently has no permitting laws?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. Well, part of the story here in Washington is, Washington gets, or at least up until recently, had this perspective that it was a progressive bastion of liberal thought, and it's just not true. I think, even as recently as 10 years ago, Washington would, I mean, policy wise, would be considered far more on the middle ground or conservative scale, depending on what we're talking about. Um, Demonstrating to lawmakers that this is a winning issue across party lines, depending on the policy, like Dr. Crifasi is saying, like depth of support per policy, I think is a challenge for sure. But starting with suicide prevention, protection orders, the stuff that is, wildly above water, and um, the vast majority of firearm owners who are, ideologically attached to the issue or not, support these things, and we know what the messaging is there. We know that it works. Part of it is getting electeds to take a little risk in talking about these things, and helping assure them that they're going to see success if you work on like an ERPO campaign or a domestic violence protection order campaign, which starts to creak the door open a little bit. And we've seen a lot of success in populations, on the east side of our state, which are definitely not Seattle, in talking about suicide prevention in particular, because it is somewhere between 65 and 70% of the firearm deaths in Washington are suicides. And I do sense that the conversation changes with electeds when we are not talking about purchase restrictions, or we're talking about regulations, but more from the, raise your hand in a room if you know somebody who has lost somebody to firearm suicide, and pretty much every hand in the room goes up. Changes the tone of the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Dylan's point about getting specific. What is the type of firearm mortality outcome that is most relevant for the folks you're talking with? I think the other thing that's really important is who the messenger is. Sometimes I might not be the best person to send the message about these laws, despite being a longtime gun owner who's an active sport shooter. I grew up hunting. My dad's a military veteran. I have a lot of connections to folks who also own firearms, but I'm also an academic, and that doesn't always land. And so again, making sure we can get the information out to folks who can be asking about it, who are from the community, who have experience, who can really connect with folks, can make a big difference.
I would add only that I'd be looking for a Republican who has a safe passageway to winning his or her nomination to office, who's looking for a way to expand his or her base to independents and Democrats, and convince that person that this is completely consistent with the Second Amendment. It doesn't violate anybody's rights, but it's a practical thing that can be done to make people safer, as Dylan and Cassandra were saying.
Thank you, everyone, for your answers. We have another very interesting question, and it says, in Oregon, the firearm purchaser licensing law was passed via ballot measure and has since been held up in courts. We have heard from firearm owners that they're not against firearm purchaser licensing laws, but have concerns about how this one was passed and worry that the permits will be inaccessible and smaller gun shops will be forced to close. And the question is, how have you addressed similar concerns in other states, and what can be done to bridge this divide to adjust the policy in Oregon or other states in similar positions?
I can take a first crack. So in the states that have firearm purchaser licensing, many of them have had them for many, many years, 100 years plus, thinking, New York, New Jersey, et cetera. Of the states that have recently passed, those are a good example to draw from. So Maryland in 2013, Connecticut in 1995, we have not seen negative impacts on the farm industry, so to speak. In fact, in many cases, there is additional economic opportunity for these shops because now people are required to take safety training. And so there is some incentive there for the shops because they can train people on what the requirements are and have that as an additional revenue stream. We have not seen gun ownership rates drop substantially post implementation of these laws either, because this is not about keeping people who can legally buy guns from getting them. This is about, there are people that we have agreed are too risky or too dangerous, at least for the short term, to be able to purchase firearms. And we want to make sure that in order to enforce the laws we have a good system to identify and screen out those individuals. So this is not about preventing ownership, but about perhaps limiting impulsive purchases, but certainly just making sure that only people who can legally buy them are getting them.
That's such an on point answer, and it actually is one of another questions, like how this laws, like firearm purchase and licensing laws, affect gun ownership, which you have already addressed. Another question from the audience that we have before we run out of time is, for states like Colorado that have recently passed gun violence prevention laws, how long before we can assess the impact from these laws in hopes to bring down gun deaths?
So in terms of firearm mortality, thankfully, even though we have far too many firearm deaths, they are still a relatively rare outcome. And so it can take some time to see how these laws move. We often think about 3, 5, 7, 10 years post implementation for changes to homicide and suicide. But in the interim, we look at things like where the guns are coming from that are recovered in crime. And that's something that you can start tracking almost immediately after a law is implemented. So in Missouri, for example, when they repealed their law, you saw an almost immediate spike in the guns that were recovered in crime in Missouri coming from Missouri. You didn't have to cross state lines to get a gun anymore. You could get them in Missouri. And we saw immediate declines in Maryland once the law went into effect. The guns that were being recovered in crime in Baltimore City weren't coming from Maryland anymore. They were coming from Virginia, Tennessee, other places on the so-called Iron Pipeline. So in the interim of these sort of more downstream mortality outcomes, we can look much more quickly at these sources of guns into the underground market to try to see what impact those laws are having.
Thank you. We have another question specific to Congressman Raskin. When advocating for these bills at the federal level, have you found folks to be receptive to the issue of firearm suicide, as most gun deaths are suicide? Dr. Crifasi has published that these laws are successful in reducing both homicide and suicide in states that have passed them. Despite so much focus on homicide, shooting is bringing suicide into the conversation. A successful advocacy position in your experience? Is the suicide risk really understood?
Well, it's an excellent point, and I appreciate, what my fellow panelists have said about it. I do think that for people who have an open mind, talking about, you know, suicide deaths along with homicide deaths is something that moves the dialogue. Um, Unfortunately, we do have to get over the general theology around the Second Amendment and what they claim it stands for, because it's only too easy for them to assert, well, people will misuse guns for lots of purposes, but that doesn't mean that the gun itself can be regulated or should be regulated consistent with the Second Amendment. So for me, in the political sphere, the critical thing is for people to understand that reasonable gun safety regulation to protect the public is perfectly consistent with the Second Amendment. And the Supreme Court has said that, just like reasonable time, place, manner restrictions on when you have a rally or where you have a rally are consistent with the First Amendment. As long as you're able to speak, it doesn't mean you can speak at 2:30 in the morning across from the White House or what have you. And it's the same thing with guns. We can regulate them in the interest of public safety while still vindicating people's right to defend themselves. With that, unfortunately, I've got to go, Sylvia, but thank you for including me, and thanks for these great comments from Cassandra and from Dylan.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. And if I could jump off of the congressman's point on constitutionality, the U.S. Court of Appeals, the Fourth Circuit, has upheld Maryland's handgun qualification license as constitutional. And at the beginning of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to take up an appeal of that decision, sort of signaling that, at least for now, they don't want to make a decision other than what the Fourth Circuit has said. And we've seen these upheld in other court cases as well. And I know that there are some mixed decisions at the state level, but when it has elevated to a higher level federally, it has been upheld, including cases in Hawaii. And I just mentioned Maryland's Fourth Circuit case. So there is a lot of evidence that these are effective. They're broadly supported, and thus far have been found to be consistent with the Second Amendment as currently interpreted by the Supreme Court.
Thank you so much for providing your insight into that. We are almost out of time, but I think we have time for one more question. Our audience says one potential offset to apparent benefits of permit to purchase or firearm purchaser licensing might be the black market and underground. FBI says that most crime guns are not acquired through any legal process. So should we distinguish outcome related to due process guns from gray or black market process guns?
Dr. Crifasi, I'd love to hear your response to this too. We ran into this quite a bit over the last couple of years in Washington State, in particular, sort of in two buckets. One, we heard this opposition argument from folks against the permit to purchase law, but also we've heard it when we are seeking to better regulate business practices for firearm dealers. So that's making sure that folks are safely storing their inventory after hours, have security cameras, et cetera. And the argument is, well, if you're bottlenecking the ability for folks to get firearms legally, you're basically putting an incentive on a gray or black market. We have not seen data that suggests that is actually what occurs. And we've also heard this point, like, well, the FBI says, firearms used in crimes are not acquired by any legal means. That's true at that part of the chain, maybe, but all firearms enter the ecosystem through some form of legal transaction, whether that is being bought by an FFL for the purpose of sale from a manufacturer, and then it goes out the back door in a duffel bag or is stolen from there, et cetera. So Dr. Crifasi, I'm sure you folks are working on data related to that, but it is just something that we encountered and had to push back quite a bit on.
Yeah, I'm sure she does, but unfortunately, we are out of time for questions. But I want to sincerely thank our panelists for this fantastic discussion. And please send us any additional questions to our email, cgvs@jh.edu. And this conversation was so enlightening to better understand how the thoughtful research that we have in one side and the advocacy and the bold policy that comes out of it can come together to address one of the most pressing public health issues of our time. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please feel free to share this conversation with your networks. Have a safe and thoughtful rest of your day.